what is a safe way to research sex with your spouse, or safe ways to explore new sexual adventures with them? So, again, I don't have the ability to interact with this person privately to understand that. I want to first of all say I am not an OBGYN or any type of physician. I say that in the sense of not only being the king of obvious, but also saying I think there is a place for this kind of conversation with your doctor to ask for research, if that's kind of the word we're using. If you mean it as a way to think through safe ways to interact accordingly, let me just say a few things on this. Number one, to each other as spouses, you want to think through the delicacy of conscience. So conscience is a gift from God that he gives as a means by which you make your decisions in any and all areas of life. Your conscience, as I've said many times before, is an interpreter of truth. It's not a determiner of truth. Your conscience can be wrong, but the Bible warns about searing your conscience, turning your conscience off. So it's not uncommon sometimes in marriage where one relationship in the marriage will have a conscience that's bothered by certain things that they are thinking about regarding sex. And I just want to make sure that you recognize that there is a freedom in one sense that you have within the context of marriage regarding your sexual activity, a freedom to enjoy the gift of sex, and yet not the freedom to unnecessarily go against the conscience of your spouse. And I say this because I think the idea of, if I can use the term in a generic way, and again, I know even sometimes hearing a pastor talk about the word sex, it feels like, oh, this is like awkward. I just thought pastors talk about words like Galatians and Ephesians and Genesis and sanctification. But it, again, is a creation of God. It's God's idea. I would say this. When you're thinking about your sex life, think about it like this. Good communication, a solid relationship before your marriage bed, and creativity, which is simply an expression of thoughtfulness to one another. So selfish sex is bad sex. Not because you're doing something wrong in action, it's because your attitude is already wrong. So you want to think about the other person accordingly. You want to find ways to honor them and encourage them. A question that's related to this is a question about, let's see, it comes up later, where... So because the wife nor husband own their own body, but share one another's, when either one asks for sex or sexual favors, should the other one be expected to oblige? This is a difficult question to answer because in one sense you're asking, are we talking about generic sexual intimacy, or are we talking about particular sexual favors, as if there's specific things being asked there? I would say this is an opportunity to go back to the text of 1 Corinthians 7. What is it saying? What is it not saying? The challenge there in the context of 1 Corinthians 7 is to recognize, number one, in their context in 1 Corinthians, in that first century church, you had Christians, new Christians, still married to their spouse who's not a Christian, and we're now thinking, well, now that I'm a Christian, and because of sort of the perversion of sex in society, we should not be having sex at all. And they just kind of like shut that part of the relationship off. And Paul's like, no, don't do that. Recognize it for what it is a gift of God, and how you should interact with each other accordingly, where you see your body as belonging to them, they see their bodies belonging to you, and so therefore there's a sense of right to the interaction with each other. But also notice what he says here about this idea of the connection to frequency, and I'm not talking like amount, but the idea of regularity as a corresponding effect to hinder or help Satan's temptation, which is going on regularly. That does not, let me say this very carefully, that does not now mean you are guilty of creating an extramarital affair temptation for your spouse. So husbands should exercise self-control, like wives should exercise self-control. This is not your proof text to be selfish in your sex life. Like, hey, you don't want me to cheat on you, do you? You don't want Satan to come in here and try to bring some other guy in front of me, do you? Or some other girl in front of me, do you? Well, I'm just going to say this now. We should do something. However, on the flip side of that is the recognition that there should be a level of regularity that is a recognized relationship you have. And if that regularity is difficult, then ask bigger questions, which is not your sex life. It's what's happening in a relationship before the marriage bed that makes sex life so difficult. That often is the bigger question to consider. Because a lot of times, not all the times, a lot of times, the sex life of a married couple is like a barometer, is like a temperature of what's happening in the marriage prior to that moment. Now, in fairness of full disclosure, sometimes I've done coupling with couples, counseling with couples, and I'm just like, sincerely, can you guys go home and have sex first, and then we can talk? Because there's just so much tension built up. There's just so much just animosity. Just watching couples like, okay, actually, I do love her. And she's like, he's actually not that bad. And I can say this in a room full of married people, except for one couple that's not married. Plug your ears. And then you'll come back later and go, I know what he's talking about. So there is a reality to that as far as how it can sometimes take what are high levels of tension and high levels of distrust and temptation and discord and be like, okay, let's have a conversation, but let's have it like at a more moderately reasonable level here. I'm just trying to keep going here. Should a married couple combine their independent finances when becoming one? Why or why not? I would say for sure yes. Why? Because you want to have, in the same way you're doing with everything else, you want a shared ideology, a shared philosophy of life, a shared goal in how you're living as a couple for the honor of Christ, and a shared focus as you raise children towards one goal. You want your finances to expressly demonstrate that unity. And ask yourself, is your lack of combining those finances an expression of fear or selfishness? It might not be. It might not be. I don't mean to accuse that. It might be like, well, that's just the way I've always done it. We've done it for a number of years in our marriage. Or we maybe saw our parents do that, and so we're just doing it. So I'm not trying to throw you under the bus like you're super ungodly and you're super selfish, but I mean to ask the question, maybe it's out of fear or distrust of your spouse, or out of selfishness and control. But one great gift that God gives to a couple is the gift of stewardship of life and the resources he gives them in life, and how they talk together about how they're going to entrust that to the Lord. How they're going to support gospel advancement work. How they're going to learn to live under their means, not above their means. How they're going to save for their future together, and not presume upon God's provision for their future. How they're going to be able to use finances as just a mechanism to talk more. A budget is such a gift to a couple. If they learn to work this out together. Many couples do not have this, and if that's a challenge for you, then let me just let you know that we have such resources at Grace Church to help you with your budgeting, thinking through the conversations financially, to bring unity and alignment there as far as more than just who gets what checking account. There's so much more in line there. The question is, how is the wife's responsibility of providing a home for the husband impacted when she works just as much as he does? It's a great question, and I want to connect this to another question that comes up. Did you not understand what providing a home for your husband is? Is it doing all the actions of the woman from the Proverbs because I can't sew or cook? I want to differentiate kind of traditional Americana roles versus biblical expressions of masculinity and femininity of being a husband and being a wife. They're not the same. Some of you perhaps grew up in an environment where it's like, he worked outside the home and she worked inside the home in the sense that, like kind of like those profiles, she's barefoot and pregnant and he's got dirty hands working the farm and God bless him, it's how it is. But when he came home, he was a bum. Sat on the couch. He's like, I did my work. Now, woman, you do your work. That's not what we're talking about. Or another wrong way we see this expression is that somehow the domestication of the home assigned to the woman is that she primarily has the loudest, if not the sole influence in the children's life. He provides for his home by making money, and she directs the home by sort of ordering the events. That's tampering with actually the biblical expression of what it looks like to live together. So, for example, it's not uncommon today, especially in a city like ours in Miami, when we have such high cost of living, that one of the ways in which wives practically help their husbands in providing for their home is actually working. because you do not have the capacity to be able to independently stay home. And that's just where each couple is sort of at with their sort of threshold of cost of living. Now, to maybe tamper with some of you in your decision making, I just want to challenge you right now. Some of you maybe have naively and foolishly committed yourself by expense to a level of lifestyle that you've basically made yourself an indentured servant to your future selves. Or rather, let me flip that statement. You've made your future selves an indentured servant to your present self and all the desires that you've already committed yourself to financially. You got cars you shouldn't have gotten, mortgages you shouldn't have gotten. You've committed to timeshares you should not have committed to. You've committed to schooling you should not have committed to. And you're pretty much, well, like that, there's your decision for the next 20 years. I think there's a place for some couples doing a full financial audit and saying, what are we giving and what are we getting? What are we giving up and what are we gaining by this? At the same time, the reality is we're not living, and I say this to somebody who's lived all over the country, Minnesota, Georgia, Colorado, South Carolina, Florida, California, Indiana, back here in Florida, particularly in Miami, we live in a very high cost of living place. So there are realities to what decisions we make with our housing, with our income. I say this as somebody, as an illustration, not as a prescription, somebody who made a decision as a husband to my wife in our conversation that we had together, living in Los Angeles, so like the only thing left is like, San Francisco or like Manhattan as far as cost of living, that when we had children, she was wanted to by her desire and by my desire as well, if that wants to support her, and I was happy for this to be the case as well, for her to be home with the children during those years that she could be home with the children. And so that just meant I had to work that much more. That meant, for example, when I was in grad school, when I was in seminary, I was in school full-time, working 60 hours a week and teaching a Bible study on Friday nights. I say this not as any expression of like, I'm amazing, not true at all, but expression of I was that committed as a man to support that opportunity for my wife. I'm not saying that's prescriptively the expectation, but I'm saying I was willing to hustle that much in order to accommodate a desire that we had come to as a couple. But I know other couples have come to the conversation based upon any number of complexities, freedom they have in Christ, that she is going to correspondingly work based on perhaps some student loan commitments you still have or other obligations you've committed yourself to. That's just not a freedom you have at this season of life. As a result of that, you then have to come to agreement as to what those roles and responsibilities are going to be in the household. So, for example, before my wife had children, she's working full-time, I'm working part-time, I'm in school full-time, so we're basically both coming home exhausted, and I've got hours of stuff to do even later on. We still have to come to agreement as to what is the reasonable expectation for us as a couple in different areas of our responsible household and managing our apartment. I say this to be very clear. There is a sense in which Titus speaks about a woman managing her household well. But notice this, there's also a thing in which elders in the local church are also have this phrase used that they're not only known for managing their household well, they're also known for their hospitality. In other words, if you have wrongly thought by gender association, oh, that's the woman's job, that's the woman's realm, and I just do things that, then you have misunderstood the biblical robustness of what a man and a woman do in the context of their home. Caring for the saints, caring for the needy, showing hospitality to Christians and non-Christians alike, loving others and serving accordingly. So we make decisions, for example, as a couple, we make decisions to not eat out as much as we otherwise wish we could. And I like eating out. Though Miami, it's crazy expensive. That's why I like Pollo Tropical. Plug your ears, Ronald. But we make decisions to not eat out as much. Why? So we can do more hospitality to people like you, to our non-Christian friends. And that's living on one income. And in case you've ever realized this, you don't ever want to go into ministry if you're looking to find wealth. So the idea is, as a couple, whether it's your financial alignment or whether it's your responsible alignment with the areas of your managing a household, how to do that together. But to do that as an expression, gentlemen, putting the mantle of responsibility and decision-making at your feet and not deferring to your wife in such a way that's like her burden to bear. I read a study this week, interestingly, that complementary relationships, or what we've been talking about these last 2 weeks, where the man and the woman have distinctly different but complementary relationships. Interestingly, in those marriages, the husbands are more involved in the home than marriages that don't have complementary belief relationships from the Bible. The perverse interpretation is that a wife would be abused if she was married to a husband who understood these sort of distinct roles, but it's actually not true biblically, because he's as equally as much feeling the weight and responsibility for what he is called to do as the head of the household, and serving and leading and helping accordingly, living with his wife understanding way. All right, a few more here. By the way, the footnote on the comment about cook, I just want to be clear. I recognize a lot of women today were never taught how to cook, and I also recognize a lot of men today love cooking. That does not make you any less a woman or any more of a man. That's not true at all. So that's an expression of how you desire to work that out in that respect. If you're going to get married tomorrow, knowing what you know now, what would you do different? I think I would be quicker to seek forgiveness, quicker to repent. Have I told the story of our first fight? Have I told this story? So we were told we're gonna be embarrassed by our first fight. We're like, well, I mean, we really love each other a lot. We were so on point, or so we thought, pretty proud. We went to a marriage conference before we even married. We just thought, I mean, honestly, we're like already batting 1,000 here. We're doing communication exercises. It's going to be great. We're just going to be rock stars. Probably by the first year our book will come out. So we're married in August, and my wife, you know, by the way, in this context, she's 20, I'm 23. I'm still in college. She's not in college. She's working full-time. I'm working full-time and in college. So we're just, it's crazy time, but it's a great time. We don't have a lot of money. I think I referenced this before. I think our annual budget, I still have the budget workbook. I think we brought in a total of $18,000. Good times. And one of my jobs was, my first job I ever had at a church, I was a custodian at the church. And I had keys to the church, and so I know, my wife's like, okay, yeah, I know, cookies, sorry. My wife's been a good helpmate to me right now. Get back on track, honey. So anyway, all that to say, we didn't have much money. So all that to say, for gifts, you can't really buy gifts for people who have a lot of money, and we're not going to go into debt to just get you to like us. So she baked, and that was cool, because I liked eating, and she liked baking, and it was like a great relationship. And I remember coming home, and she had already been home, and she was baking, and she had these cookies with this icing on top, and she said, do you want some? I was like, sure. And she's like, well, here's a plate of the broken cookies. Just eat some of those. I mean, I'm the husband. I deserve more than a broken cookie. I want a good, ta-da, there it is, that beautiful, perfect cookie. Icing on top. And I was like, no, can I have one of those icing cookies? And she's like, well, it's the same, just eat one of the broken ones. And I'm like, I don't want a broken cookie. I want a real cookie. She's like, it is real. I'm like, it's not real, it's broken. I feel like this was a statement she was making about me. I deserve a whole cookie. And she's thinking, I deserve a different husband right now. We got in this huge fight over broken cookies. What would I do differently? I would eat the stinking broken cookie. Doesn't matter. Now, my wife, to represent her, she would just give me the whole cookie. She's going to be a baby like that. The point is that I think to this question, I think I would just recognize that a lot of what you just get passionate about, you just kind of over-tweak. And I was in a context where I thought, man, I want to do marriage right. My mom and dad were divorced when I was young. My mom remarried to my stepdad, who is my dad today, whom I love. But the gospel did not come to our home for years. So, you just see bad examples. And my parents would own that to this day. And I saw, honestly, a lot of bad examples in the church. I saw what I referred to as spiritual eunuchs. There might have been men in anatomy, but they were not men in function. And I thought, I'm going to be a man. I'm going to lead. So I made everything a principled point of my leadership. I mean, I just was all about it. And I would take, like Ephesians 5, don't let the sun go down your anger. And I was like, we are not going to go to bed until we work this out. 2 o'clock in the morning. She's like, I just want to go to sleep. I'm like, no. All this zeal. None of the gentleness, patience, wisdom. Now, honestly, I mean, how smart can you really be when you're 23, right? You're like, you're just stupid. I'm sorry if you're 23. You're just. But I just, you can't know what you don't know being 23 versus now 47. I just know that if I look back, I just wouldn't get so worked up about things. My wife loves me. I love my wife. We're going to be fine. At least half of what we fought over was like not worth it. The other half probably should take like half the amount of time. And I don't say this as an exercise in cowardice, like, oh, you're kind of giving up. Like, no, some things are worth pursuing and pushing into. But if you're pursuing and pushing everything, you're sort of like just drowning out too much. It's like a preacher's always yelling. If he's emphasizing everything, he's emphasizing nothing. Because it all just sounds the same. And I would just say as a couple, you have to choose wisely what you're really going to focus in on. What are some guidelines or limitations that I should consider when making an appeal to my husband regarding a decision he's making which I don't agree with? For the recording, there is a whole chapter in here on this question about what? A biblical appeal. Okay. So, yeah, there's a chapter here on how to make a biblical appeal to your husband. So you're like, do I have to read a book just to get my question answered? No. You can come up to my wife later and ask, but let me just try to summarize it briefly, not knowing what the chapter is saying, but just to give some general guidelines here. In humility, through prayer, even seeking counsel from perhaps other women if there is a pressing point of concern, even making an appeal to others if it's being an ungodly decision, but also recognizing, as we're seeing in Ephesians chapter 5, unto the Lord, it's okay for your husband to be wrong and you be right, but not self-righteously holding that over his head. Told you so. But as a way of just recognizing your husband's growing in leadership like you're growing in submission. And you being patient with him like he's being patient with you. And recognizing that no one's perfecting their role all the time. And so the question is the decision being made, if it's a decision about finances, if it's a decision about parenting, a decision, a number of things for the different levels. And at that point, I'll defer to the chapter giving more specifics on. Last question here. How do you encourage a couple where sex is not enjoyable and is done more as an obligation due to the act of being more so painful and uncomfortable? I mean, honestly, I'll say that I think probably this question should be teased out with another couple in conversation. And by I say tease out, meaning kind of detailed to get more context. Because I say this very carefully, sex is so personal and it can be so painful that I want to be careful to not be an insensitive pastor, an insensitive man, insensitive husband, to just broad brush this question with a quick answer as if it's just that easy. It's often not that easy. But I would say that this is an opportunity for this couple to speak about love, fear, humility, joy, service, patience, to speak to the person in the relationship who maybe wishes for more in frequency or relationship, to say, are you willing to be patient and wait longer than you otherwise would? So in other words, let me ask you this question. If you're wanting to have more frequency or more intimacy, what if you could get that now, but lose your wife's heart for the next 5 years? Versus, what if you could wait 12 months to not have the frequency or the level of intimacy they otherwise wish, in order to have that 12 months of relationship building time in order to have your wife's heart for the next 10 years? I think when I frame it like that, you understand the answer is obviously implied in the question, but to recognize this is an opportunity to love each other, outdo one another in honor, being patient with each other, and really having to go back to the Lord and say, God, how do I serve my spouse, even if I don't think my spouse is serving me that I think biblically I could make a case for? Beyond that, I would say to what I said just a few minutes ago in the introduction to this question, seek counsel from another older couple, older man to a younger man, an older woman to a younger woman, as far as how you find that as a point of conversation, I think can be very, very encouraging. I just want to say at Grace Church, that's a common practice that we want to encourage couples to do, is to seek an older couple that you would trust in their wisdom with the word, walking with integrity to do that. And I want to make sure that you know, even as the pastors here at Grace Church, we want to offer that as well.